you on behalf of Global Ties Alabama. We have been hosting Global Perspective Institutes weekly since the beginning of May, and we are excited today because we're dealing with a topic that's kind of sensitive, that needs more information, awareness out in the public. And we're delighted that we have the expertise today of our panelists and our moderator, who have in varied ways been involved in human trafficking, developing a unified response to that topic and that issue that is another one of the plagues in our communities these days. It is a global issue, and I'm really delighted that we have as our moderator today, Micah Wells. He's a true international attorney. Quite often we have international professionals who have traveled through countries, but Micah has actually practiced and lived in North America, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. He's also been one of our panelists on a Global Perspective Institute, living and working globally. But most important is that he is one of our online trivia, World Quest Trivia program that took place over the last 4 to 5 weeks. And we're delighted to have him today as a moderator. Micah, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Gail. It's an absolute honor to be here today. So thank you very much, Jackie. Like you said, this is an extremely very difficult and very necessary topic. One that I myself have seen up front, and it just turned me as a human being. So to be able to participate in this, and then speaking with our guest panelists who I'll introduce, that it's right next door. You know, it's happening in front of our eyes, which is really shows how naive I am. And thank you very much for that introduction. I've been around the world, but never realized that there was trouble right next door. And so this is something that is extremely, extremely important. And I believe that we all can work together to make things better. A little bit of the ground rules for this. We only have 45 minutes, and with this topic, it's extremely broad. So I'm going to start by introducing Ms. Gates first, and then I'll let her speak for 10 minutes. Then after that, I'll give an introduction in the bio of Chris Lim and allow him to speak for 20 minutes. And then after that, we'll reserve our last 10 minutes for questions and answers, if that's okay. So here we go. Our first person who I'd like to introduce is Ms. Verna Gates, and she is the freelance journalist and also the president of Global Ties Alabama. I think it would be a disservice for me to just say that, and I want to give a little bit of her bio, because our two experts that we have today, what makes this panel so important is that they are truly experts. They are groundbreakers. So bear with me as I read a little bit about them, because they bring huge value added to this topic. Ms. Verna Gates, and she was awarded the Communicator of Achievement by the National Federation of Presswomen, which is a lifetime achievement award based on career and community service. She formerly reported for the world's largest news organization, Reuters International News Service, which reaches over 1 billion readers and has over 417,000 media outlets around the world. What makes her so important for this topic is that she was one of the very first persons to break news of the I-20 corridor of underage sex trade in the year of 2006. Her response from that was to start the Fresh Air Family Fund, which is a not-for-profit organization that teaches science to children and families. She began her career with CNN, and her career as a journalist has carried her throughout the world, and she's reported for Time Magazine, The Guardian, and National Public Radio. So with this background, we have an absolute person who is more than qualified, and she really has set this stage. And we look forward to her talking about her background on the investigative reporting on human trafficking in Alabama. So with that, Ms. Gates, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It was back in 2006, and actually a friend of mine, Mickey Goodman, who I invited to join us today, had found this story and invited me to come with Reuters, and we wrote it together. And we interviewed all kinds of folks from law enforcement who are working to stop this. The thing that really impressed me was we went to a house, a facility that was trying to rehab girls who had been taken out of trafficking. And we talked to a lot of girls about how this happened to them. And the stories, I did start a nonprofit to try to prevent this from happening to girls. I work with 7,500 kids a year now, trying to teach them how to make good decisions, because these girls did not make good decisions in many ways. And sometimes they were forced into bad decisions. But it's just, I could not shut my eyes and not see 13-year-old ex-prostitutes. It just was impossible. And we learned from what Atlanta has the world's busiest airport. And that makes it a very good place to have underage sex trade. And for some reason, people think that sleeping with a girl under the age of 16 protects them from diseases, which actually is not true. Their tissues are more likely to be damaged and therefore carry more diseases. But it literally happens day in and day out that people will book an underage prostitute on Craigslist or on Blacklist or any other internet service, and they'll fly in to a shady hotel near the airport, have their fun, and fly back for supper with their families. It happens all the time with shocking regularity. And I was really surprised from the different stories of how the girls got caught up in this. To me, the saddest ones were the ones who were sold by their families, which really happens. Their families will sell them into prostitution. And some were foster kids who had been molested and raped in foster homes who ended up doing that. Some were runaways. I mean, the estimation that from the law enforcement we talked to in Atlanta said that an estimated 90% of female runaways end up in prostitutions. Half of those end up in prostitution within 48 hours of leaving home. Because what happens is that they have these people, and I always thought that in the Natalie Holloway case, which I also covered, that Joanne Vandersloot was the epitome of a sex trade recruiter. Charming, young men or charming young women who lead you into believing they're going to be your friend and they're going to help you, and they're innocent and harmless. They're just going to go to a party, and you end up in prostitution. One girl was really sad too. I talked to. She had been into rap music with her friends, and they thought it was so funny. And I've hated rap music ever since. A friend of mine yells at me because when I get in an Uber and they're playing rap, I'm like, turn that off. But anyway, they talked about the pimps and the hoes and laughed and talked about that. And then one day they said, oh, let's do it. And she ended up being prostituted by her own friends, and just totally betrayed by that. There were almost none that we talked to, maybe one who actually was kidnapped and taken into this. Mostly it was people they knew, families, a runaway who met someone they thought was going to help them and really did not. And they were trying various ways. The saddest part about them in this rehab I went to is you almost can't bring them back, because they basically break you down and build you back as a prostitute. It starts out with nice clothes, and you go to nice dinners and this, that, and the other. And then the beating start. I mean, every one of them talked about being beaten, being drugged. If they don't, I mean, one poor woman had her pelvis broken in a beating and still had to go out that night and service 20 Johns. Or being drugged and just, drugged out of their minds while men lined up outside of hotel rooms. It was just absolutely the most horrifying thing. It truly is the mouth of hell. It truly is the mouth of hell. And I just came home thinking, we have got to help these children to make better decisions, to try to have some people or an organization that believes in them. So when they do run away, they have somebody to call and they're not just on the streets. And places like Atlanta, the trafficking part of this, and this is why the I-20 corridor is so important. Atlanta has, people, they move people in and out of Atlanta. Like if there's a Super Bowl there, if there's a big concert there, if there's a big convention there, the traffickers are really strangely, incredibly organized, even though there's a serious sort of a small town pimps. But underage sex trade, they estimate, is now the third largest money maker in crime these now under it's drugs, guns, and underage sex trade, the top 3 money makers for organized crime. But they'll bring them in, and prostitute them at and if there's like in Phoenix, there's another big event the next weekend, they'll drive them up there. So they're trafficking them all over the place. And one reason they do that is to find big events where people will be looking for prostitutes. And the other is you can't find them. They disappear. They may get a track on them and then they just vanish. And one man that this woman, one of the policemen told me about, she pretends she's 13 years old online. 12, 13 years old. And this man drove all the way from like Michigan to Atlanta. And he had a teddy bear and condoms and methamphetamines. And he expected to find a child there. And instead he found a policewoman, which is what he truly deserves. But it's just really, and some of the thing driving it is is pornography, which is now anonymous, available, and affordable. And it's kind of raising the rates of demand for prostitution and younger girls. So it's really was a scary, terrible thing to talk to and to witness. But almost all of, and they even are open. I can't believe this happens. They have players conventions. They're called players. The pimps are called players. They had a big convention in Atlanta where they openly bought and sold women. And the estimates, these are not foreign girls, they estimate 300, this is in 2006, it's probably more now when I did the investigative report, that 300,000 of our girls, American girls, are caught up in this. It's probably 500,000 by now that they're actually doing this. It's just really frightening how they're, and the demand, and criminalizing it for the women and not catching the pimps and the johns is probably part of the driving of this, and the internet where you can easily find somebody. You don't have to be a streetwalker. And they say that in Atlanta, the average age of streetwalker is about between 16 and 18. Isn't that scary? They're not even old enough to vote. I mean, hardly to vote or to drink, even an alcohol. And yet here they are, working girls, so to speak. And I came to fully believe that prostitution is not a victimless crime. Who really wants that as a career? And most of those women, if they don't produce, if they're sick, if they have a broken bone, if they don't want to do it, they don't feel good, they're driven. Their pimps make all the money. Very few of them have any money. A lot of them were locked up during the day. They were, and if they tried to escape, they'd be severely beaten. And the pimps kind of trade. They beat them, and then the love. The abuse cycle is just. It's more than just the prostitution. It's the whole abuse cycle of these poor women who are so young. And how do you bring them back after an experience like that? The psychology of them they're broken. And it's just a very American tragedy that we have. And I believe my 10 minutes is up, Micah. I'm an old TV producer. I was able to do that in my exact time.
All right. Thank you very much. Bernard, that was fantastic. That was really fantastic. You've got 2 minutes left because we're at 1:13. Quick question. Okay. We've identified the problem. What do you think are the solutions in 2 minutes? And I know I'm going to ask this to Chris later, but I just want to see with what you've done in your investigation, what would be the solution? We've identified the problem. What's your solution?
There are a number of them. One is we've got to better educate our children, and we've got to strengthen our families. And that's one of the things I'm trying to work on. Because as a reporter, I didn't see people who made good decisions. You screwed up somewhere. If we can teach people to think and think through problems, we can help. One decision often makes a life tragic. That's one thing. Two is we've got to start arresting the Johns, and we've got to start blaming the people and getting the pimps. We've got to go in that deeply, and we've got to look at the internet to see what sites are allowing this thing to happen, that they're openly trading and swapping out human flesh, basically. I mean, that's the worst kind of slavery imaginable. A woman who's chained up at night and during the day so she can work nights in a horrible profession like this. And very few boys, by the way, it's very few men. Very few males are involved, are male prostitutes. If they are, they're generally independent. They're not working with pimps. It's all the girls that are being controlled by these folks.
Okay, Bernard, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to Chris Lim, and Chris is going to talk about the conditions relating to human trafficking in Alabama and his work to develop a unified protocol system for human trafficking within the state of Alabama. And as Verna is an expert, Chris also is an expert. And again, I'm going to take a minute or two to read his bio because he brings a wealth of knowledge as a real expert. Presently, he is serves as the project director and adjunct professor at the University of Alabama for the Alabama Uniform Integrated Human Trafficking Initiative. He's a 14-year veteran of law enforcement with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and after his career in law enforcement, Chris worked with nonprofit organizations providing direct services to victims of human trafficking. He was the vice president of Justice and Restoration with Saving Innocence, an organization in Los Angeles that works with minors who are victims of sex trafficking. He also served as the chief operating officer of End Slavery Tennessee in Nashville, working with victims of both sex and labor trafficking and operating safe houses. He's also been a volunteer investigative associate with the International Justice Mission since 2014, and he has spoken, trained, and conducted security operations, and worked in an undercover capacity in brothels and massage parlors to help victims of human trafficking. He holds a BA in philosophy and MBA, and he's currently a doctoral student at the University of Alabama pursuing a PhD in human trafficking. So he brings a lot of expertise, and so we're absolutely thrilled to get the ins and outs from his perspective. So thank you very much. Vernon, great job, and we look forward to hearing what Chris has to say. Chris?
Great, thank you, Micah. And yeah, it is an honor to be here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of just share some of the stuff that we're working on and what's going on here in Alabama. We had the opportunity actually to do some research in 2017, and so I have some updated numbers and some data how human trafficking is impacting the state, and so that'll be helpful too for us to understand. But I think it'd be helpful because there might be some people that are either watching this live or later watching this recorded that may not understand what human trafficking is. And Verna just gave us some horrific and yet eye-opening examples of what it looks like. And I just want to quickly break it down, kind of the legal definition, if you will, of what human trafficking is. And sometimes that's helpful to get an understanding of what it is we're talking about. And so a lot of times it's broken down into three kind of categories: an act, a means, and a purpose. And an act might be something like recruiting somebody or harboring somebody or transporting somebody. The means, it speaks about how they're doing that. So maybe it's through violence, or maybe it's through coercion or fraud or deception. And then the purpose is what they're trying to, how they're going to victimize that person. So either through sex or labor. And each of those has a plethora of different ways that that could happen. So there's a lot of different ways, for example, that sex trafficking happens. And there's a lot of different ways that labor trafficking happens. But those are kind of the two broad categories. And so when you have a combination of kind of those three categories, you have human trafficking. So to put it together, and maybe using some of the examples that we just heard from Verna, if you have somebody that has abducted somebody through force for the means of prostituting them, that's human trafficking. And likewise, if you have somebody that is recruiting somebody through the means of deception to have them perform some sort of labor, maybe working at a restaurant or something, that could be human trafficking as well. So if you have those three pieces together, it's human trafficking. One key thing to remember, though, is that for minors, nationally under 18 and in Alabama 19 and under, you don't have to prove, so a prosecutor or law enforcement don't have to prove the means. So they don't have to, and typically we summarize the means by saying force, fraud, or coercion. So prosecutors don't have to prove that a minor was either forced into sex work or was coerced or anything like that. They just have to prove that it actually was attempted, that somebody was doing something for that purpose. And so that's helpful for law enforcement, because a lot of times, as we just heard, there's so much trauma involved with these victims, and especially if they're young, but even as adults, if you or I were forced to do any of these things that we just heard stories about, we would be traumatized. But think if you're an 11 or 12 or 13-year-old child, just how much more complex that trauma is. And so that's an important tool for law enforcement and prosecutors to have in trying to mitigate these instances of human trafficking. And so what we've been able to do in Alabama is the School of Social Work at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa received a grant from the Department of Justice in 2017 to research and create a statewide human trafficking protocol. And so I was brought in to kind of lead that project up. And what we did was we spent the first year doing our research, predominantly through focus groups. And we went throughout the entire state and conducted 20 different focus groups, geographically located throughout the entire state, where we invited professionals that actually work with victims of human trafficking, and just kind of asked them a series of questions to get an idea of the prevalence of human trafficking in the state and the scope of it, meaning, prevalence meaning like how much, how often, what's what's the frequency of human trafficking in the state, and then the scope, meaning like where is it happening and what does it look like? What types of human trafficking are taking place? So we did that for the first year. In the second year, we analyzed that data. We just continued the relationships with the people that we met and are working in this field. And then the third year, which is actually the year that we're in right now, is we're actually writing up the report on that and working with all of these partners to create a statewide human trafficking protocol. And so some of the folks that were involved in these focus groups were from law enforcement, local, state, and federal law enforcement, from social services, child welfare, from the faith community, mental health, medical, really the gamut. Anybody and everybody that has anything to do with working with victims of human trafficking is who participated. And we ended up having 114 of these, who I call frontline people, that are working with these victims of human trafficking, that participated in these focus groups. And from those 114 people, we were really able to learn a lot. What we discovered is that in the state of Alabama, and this was, we were asking them kind of open-ended questions like you do in focus groups about their experience from 2017. So really the data that the updated research and data that we have is a snapshot of 2017. It represents kind of the experience of that year in Alabama. And what we realized is that in 2017, there were probably about 1,167 people that are potentially victims of human trafficking in Alabama that had some sort of contact with some of these professionals in some way. That's important to understand too, just kind of conceptually, that these contacts were not necessarily like they're being rescued out of human trafficking. It might have been with a nurse in a hospital or a clinic, or it might have been with a counselor, or just any other service that they might have been receiving by a community member. maybe you know, a homeless shelter or some other social service provider. So these weren't actual cases of human trafficking in the state, but rather they were individuals that showed signs or indications of potentially being a victim of human trafficking in the state. The sad thing, and kind of the horrifying thing, is, as we really heard from Verna already, is that the majority of these are minors. You know, from our research, we were able to determine that about 57% of them, or 665 in 2017, in Alabama, were potentially victims of human trafficking, children. And so there's a huge need in the state, you know, and we just heard about the need around kind of the Birmingham, Jefferson County area along the I-20. And the sad thing is, and maybe it's grown since then, or maybe we just didn't know back in the early 2000s, but the sad reality is that human trafficking is happening throughout the entire state. And in fact, there's an organization called Polaris, and they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So when you call that human trafficking hotline number, they create a heat map that shows you where throughout the entire United States calls about human trafficking are coming in. And when you look at that map for 2017 for the state of Alabama, there's actually a higher concentration, a little bit lower in the state along I-85, where there's a clear line showing those heat spots all the way from like we heard, from Atlanta, going all the way out to Mississippi through Demopolis, you know, along the I-85. So it's happening along the major cities, it's happening along the major highways, but it's also happening in small rural communities. Again, I mean, the work that Verna did and that she just shared with us, just so eye-opening, and it confirms what the research that we did, that oftentimes it's happening through what we call familial trafficking, or trafficking that's done by a parent or close relative, a family member. And sometimes that looks like, you know, maybe it's driven by poverty or drug addiction or some other addiction, where a mom or a dad or an uncle is offering the sexual services of a young member of their family to neighbors or to friends to pay for an addiction, or maybe to pay for rent or something like that. So it permeates our entire culture. And it's not just here in Alabama, you know, and we heard, I mean, it's in Atlanta, it's everywhere. And probably the other striking thing that I realized after talking to all of our partners and doing all of this research is that, you know, I've had the opportunity to kind of do a little bit of work with victims, not just here in the United States, but in Southeast Asia and in Africa and in the Middle East, and seen a lot of different types of human trafficking. And the sad thing is that right here in Alabama, just about every form of human trafficking that exists in the world is happening to some degree and at some level here in our very state. And so it's important that we get all of our partners together and that we create this strategic plan of how to move forward as a state collaboratively and comprehensively to address the issues of human trafficking within the state. And so that's really kind of the project that we're working on. And what we're doing this year is creating that, laying that foundation, creating that infrastructure, if you will. And actually, I'd say, honestly, creating is not the right word, because there's a lot of really good people in the state that are doing great work around this issue and have been for a number of years. I think some of them probably driven by that amazing report that Verna did, I think in 2006. And I think that maybe opened the eyes for some of the people in the state that have really for many years have been working on this issue. And so we have some really good law enforcement partners. We have really good social service partners. We have really good nonprofit organizations throughout the state that are working tirelessly on this issue. And so really what we're doing is we're not creating really, anything. We're kind of really bringing everybody together and saying, hey, let's all get on the same page and let's address this collaboratively and strategically throughout the state so we could be more effective in both recovering and helping victims heal, and then also mitigating, by arresting traffickers and Johns, and then also kind of going upstream a little bit and thinking about what are things that we could do preventatively to keep this from being a problem for the next generation. And so there's a lot of work that's going on in that. And I wanted to share kind of that whole picture that there are a lot of really good people that are doing great work. In fact, one bright spot in the state is that there's another organization that takes that creates an annual report that measures each state on how their legislation is responding to the issue of human trafficking. And Alabama actually is one of the best states in the nation in regards to the laws that we have that address human trafficking. And so in some ways, what we need to do is we actually need to catch our services and our processes and our resources. We need to catch all of that up to these amazing laws that we already have and to be able to take full advantage of those. And so that's a summary, I guess, of what we're doing and what we're looking at, for the coming years here in the state in terms of addressing human trafficking.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much. That was fantastic. You mentioned something international. I know we're focused on Alabama, but my experience with human trafficking has been on the international side. I just want to share a couple of my stories. I mean, I've been in airports in Eastern Africa where you see girls who are hopping on a plane, speaking nothing, have no idea where we're going, and they're just headed out to a Middle East country to serve as domestic slaves, basically. Not even, I mean, it's sickening. Or in another East African country where, people, that they're going to get transported from East Africa through Yemen, where there's a civil war, cholera, and now COVID, to get to the Middle East for a better way of life. And they're paying for this. And to see it personally, it's just absolutely shocking. And for me, sickening, to see how, as you talked about, and as Vernon talked about, how human beings are treated as chattel, and I'm a little disheartened because everybody knows what's going on, but, nobody's doing anything. So just my two cents there that I just wanted to add on that I've seen it. And when you see it up front, it's demeaning, for us as society to see this, and I come back here, right, and to see it happen and know that it's happening right here within our own state, in our own neighborhood, is shocking. It's just absolutely shocking. So let's go ahead and move on to questions and answers. But before we do that, I know that we do have a person who I'd like to acknowledge who may want to also speak for a minute or two, is Miss Carol Potter of the Wellness Center. And Ms. Potter, if you're available, would you like to join us and tell us a little bit about your organization for a minute or two?
Not sure she's on.
Okay. All righty. Okay. Well, she was going to join us, but not. Now, let's go ahead and open this up for questions. If I may start with the first question. Chris and Vernon, can you give us what are the demographics of how do we spot, who a potential victim is? Is there a certain demographic, economically, ethnically, religiously? Who are these young girls that we see walking down the street?
You want me to take first shot at that?
Yeah, sure.
First shot, I'll tell you what mine is. Okay.
Yeah, there is no stereotypical demographic of either a victim or a John, frankly, or a trafficker. it comes from all walks of life. I would say, I think there's two things that are common though from victims, not just here in Alabama, but throughout the world. Two things that, maybe three things that are exploited, really, because when it comes down to it, that's what trafficking is you're exploiting something in these victims. And I think I typically see it in three things. One is poverty. So I think poverty drives a lot of it. You know, like Brenda was saying earlier, I mean, there is no 13-year-old girl that is going to think, gee, I'm going to go inside my body. You know, I think that's a fun thing to do. So poverty is one driver. The other two are really some of the drivers in terms of what the traffickers look for when they're victimizing somebody. And they start with this process that that Vern kind of talked about, it is that what we call it grooming. And traffickers tend to look for two things. One is an aspiration or a hope that somebody has. And in this case, you know, we typically think of young girls and sex trafficking, but it can be men or boys and labor trafficking as well. But they exploit a hope or, you know, an aspiration. And then the second thing would be they exploit the lack of a relationship in their lives, and try to groom them as if they were their boyfriend. So kind of those three things: hope or aspiration, love, and poverty, I would say.
Okay, Berna?
Well, unfortunately, when in 2006, at least when I was doing this, there's a great deal of racism in the trafficking industry. I told you I covered the Natalie Holloway. I'm convinced still that she's in a private collection, because it's blue-haired blonde is called a swan, and they bring the top dollar. Because, you know, real blonde hair is fairly rare, and they want the young blonde, blue-eyed girls will bring a higher price. And a lot of the demographics comes from foster care, because, you know, a lot of what happens when you're in foster home at 18, you're dumped out. And usually a lot of them are dumped out a little bit before that, and they don't have a place to go. They don't have a job. They don't have hardly any possessions. They don't have a way to really do very much. And so a lot of girls in foster care, and a lot of them have been molested. That tends to be one demographic is coming out of in poverty. If you have drug addicted parents, I mean, one girl told me about her dad who, from the time she was 6 years old, was watching porn with him. And by the time she was 9, he was selling her out so he could buy his drugs. Wow. And drug addiction is another one that really drives that. It's just pitiful.
Wow.
With the way these girls are selected and treated, but they're looking for vulnerability, whether it's money or, like you said, the hope of the dream, or a girl who has no place to go, who's wondering where she's going to sleep that night. And you say, oh, we've got a great place. We have friends there, and and you go and you never leave. It's like the Hotel California.
Okay, thank you, Bert. Chris, I had asked Vern earlier about a solution. What's your solution? What is the solution, in your opinion?
Yeah, so, and that's actually kind of what we're working on. And so the solution is addressing this collaboratively and comprehensively. So collaboratively meaning all of the agencies and institutions in the state that play a role in helping these victims and or prosecuting criminals. They need training, and they need resources, and they need to be working together. And then comprehensively, in terms of looking at this, not just, and again, typically when we think of and when we talk about human trafficking, we're thinking of and talking about young girls. But especially in Alabama, we have a lot of people that are being trafficked in the agricultural business and in the hospitality business. And so we need to kind of expand our thinking in terms of looking at other victims and other types of trafficking that are happening throughout the state. So bringing all of those resources together and thinking more macro, on a more macro level, to bring those resources together is kind of the two things that it boils down to addressing the issue.
Do you feel that governmental agencies, state, federal, and local, are doing enough to solve this issue? Or is it a community-based issue or a community-based solution without federal government, state, and local government being involved?
Really needs both.
I don't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Verna.
If they're, like you, Chris, if they're moving them around, how can the local find them? The only way local can help, right, Chris, is to try to do prevention, to try to have a place where people can go, to have organizations they can turn to when they need help, rather than going on the streets and finding a stranger who's helpful. I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It requires both. You need to address it on a local level, and a lot of that can be preventative type stuff. Where we're doing a lot of education, perhaps in those professions that have high touch points with victims, medical community, schools, obviously law enforcement and first responders and that sort of thing. But it does require, either statewide and or federal resources, because that's what these traffickers are exploiting. Not only are they exploiting the vulnerabilities of an individual that they're trafficking, they're exploiting the vulnerabilities of our communities and the structures that we have in place. And so, just like Verna mentioned earlier, that you have weapons trafficking and drug trafficking as well, right? And so, none of these crimes respect borders, and in fact, they use borders as a means of their business model. And so we need to be able to collaborate across state lines and even across national lines to be able to address this effectively.
Great. Well, listen, thank you very much. I see that we're coming back on the 2 or 3 minutes left, and I'd like to turn it back over to Jackie as the director. I know, first of all, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Verna, for, in my opinion, and I'm sure everyone else's opinion, an absolute wonderful and very fact-fulfilled presentation. So thank you very much for taking time out of each of your busy schedules for this very important topic. We can't do it all in 45 minutes, but I think you guys have set a great foundation. And again, thank you very much. I know there will be a follow-on next week, and I'm sure Jackie will talk about that. So I'll turn it back over to Jackie Shape, the director of Global Ties Alabama. Thank you, Jackie, for allowing me to participate.
Yeah, no, Micah, thank you very much. And to Verna and Chris, thank you for enlightening our audience this afternoon, not only to the current state, but giving us the historical background. This topic is a critical one. It's one that, as our speakers have talked about, the resources moving forward and what we can do to help families and help our young people. And to know that it is not just sexual, but the labor trafficking has been a long-term issue throughout our nation and throughout the world. So I want to thank you and thank our audience for being with us. And I'd like to encourage our audience to join us next week. There will be a difference. It will be at 5:00 p.m. and we'll be focusing on partnerships to combat human trafficking. It's critical, as Chris and Verna has said, not one organization, not one segment of our community will be able to resolve this major issue, but working together. So we're delighted that we'll have the Alabama Fusion Center, which is part of the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency at the state level. We'll also have the Cullman County Human Trafficking Task Force. We're really, as an organization, privileged to have professional resources that we call upon when we have our international delegations that we host in partnership with the U.S. Department of State and our U.S. Congress. And to be able to leverage those resources and bring it to our local community, this has just been another privilege. So we're really thankful for those of you who have attended. We'd invite you to join us next Tuesday, June 30th at 5:00 p.m. for part 2 of the human trafficking story. Again, partnerships to combating human trafficking. Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions, and please feel free to encourage others to join our Global Perspectives Institute. Thanks so much, and have a great day and a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you. I thought it went well.
Right. I very much enjoyed it. All the best. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if it's a topic you can enjoy, but it is interesting and something we need to address, isn't it?
I know. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.